with you about nutrient metrics and how they sometimes really turn out to be a lot of babble. So let's get started. Why do we even use food metrics? Well, really the reason is that we want to simplify our lives. We're taking a meal or a whole set of meals and trying to distill it down into the properties that have some relevance to our health. We can't think about all the properties of all meals at one time. So, for example, if you look at this set of different dishes, there are so many different ways you could look at it. You could be looking at piles of vitamins and minerals. You could be seeing this as being high in calories or low in calories. You could think about how satisfying it might be to eat each of these different meals. And when you do that, are you thinking about components like taste or, how your stomach would feel at the end? Do you have some idea what pleasure you would get from it? Or maybe you're looking for color. For example, there are people who think that we should be eating from a diverse color palette and that that's important for our health. Or maybe we're looking for how many carbs it has or how processed it is. And if you're thinking about processing, what counts to you as processing? If you look at the cabbage there, the red cabbage, that's probably been fermented, and fermentation is a process. Everything that's on this set of meals is basically been cooked. I didn't give raw representation, and cooking is a kind of processing. And then maybe you're thinking about slicing. So would you say that the French fries in one of the pictures is more processed because it comes sliced and not like the so-called whole food potatoes that are with the roast? All of those meals were solid. Some people think that you shouldn't drink your calories. So here's another set of things that you may or may not think is good for you. So there's all kinds of ways that you could choose to classify different foods and different diets. But the thing about our classification is that what we measure reveals our position about what we think is important. And what we think is important comes from at least two different things. So we have our goals, and those goals might be simply like making sure you get adequate nutrition without deficiencies. For some people, that's a really basic, important goal. Or maybe you're after some kind of particular body composition type. Or maybe you just want to live long and prosper without the burden of chronic disease. The second thing that determines what you measure is your theory about how to get those goals. So if you think that weight loss is fundamentally down to calories, you're going to measure things differently than if, for example, you think it's down to carbohydrates. If you think that longevity is affected by how much cholesterol you have or how much fiber you're getting, then you'll be measuring those. Maybe like the proverbial Inuit, you'll have 100 words, not for snow, but for fiber. So what you look for when you're evaluating a meal is directly related to your theories about how that food affects your goals. So this is where the science comes in. Most people don't think about how important this first step is, but as a previous data scientist, I actually had a job where my title, my team name was called feature engineering. And so we thought about this all the time, and anyone who works with a lot of data is going to. Choosing what features to look at is already committing to a bias because you obviously can't look at everything. So you have to make choices on what you already believe. And then the second step, well, that's what epidemiology is for. It's actually what it's good for. And it's also what we do as individuals. We notice correlations between features and outcomes that we're interested in. The nice thing that epidemiology actually does well is, whereas we might get fixated on a particular feature and then kind of forget to notice when it doesn't correlate with the outcome, epidemiology, at least in theory, should be looking at all these correlations and really validating whether they're happening. Then the third step, and this is something that even scientists often forget to take, and that is to actually test the hypothesis to figure out if manipulating those features actually has a corresponding manipulation on the outcome. But we've got to be careful with our thoughts about how important and how good RCTs actually are, because even the sacred RCT has confounding biases, or can have confounding biases built in, right? If you happen to choose features that happen to depend on other features, then you might mistakenly believe it's a cause because your experiment didn't end up decoupling them. So if you look at this meal, I think a lot of people think that there's something wrong with this meal in particular. In this crowd, in the low-carb crowd, we're very familiar with people looking at that and seeing high fat, and the low-carb crowd might say, why blame the burger for what the bread did, right? But the fact is that high carb is a cultural default. So when you see all these studies, it's a very common thing. You'll see a study that says, we compared high fat to low fat, and their high fat is actually a high fat and a high carb diet. And that's because high carb is the cultural default. So nobody would even think to really manipulate that as part of what it means to be a high fat diet, whereas in the low carb context, obviously it does. So nonetheless, any diet that you might choose that says don't eat a food like the one that's pictured will hit all those factors at the same time. And so if you decide to cut out those foods and then it ends up helping your goal, the conclusion that you draw about it is going to depend very much on what you were seeing when you decided to cut those out. This is Charles Goodhart, and he's an economist. And this quote that I've picked is what is usually meant when people talk about Goodhart's law. He says, any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. That's a bit jargony and hard to understand, so when most people talk about Goodhart's law, they actually quote this person instead. This is Marilyn Strathern, who is an anthropologist. And the way that she phrased it was, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So one canonical way that people compare Goodhart's law is when they're talking about testing scores, standardized tests. So you might want to know something you can't measure very well when you're looking at applications from college students. How well are they going to actually do in university? And there's something that you can measure, it's very easy to measure, that in some cases tends to correlate with that thing that you really want to know, whether they're going to do well. And that's these test scores. But the problem is when students start targeting those scores, they find that the correlation breaks down because they're targeting it. So, if people are paying big money to take classes to help them perform well in this test, then the test is more and more going to start reflecting wealth, for example, instead of some kind of cognitive ability. Similarly, you can imagine a scenario where the thing that you really want to know and can't measure very well is how informative or relevant certain web pages to somebody's search. So you want to rank your search results, and you have to measure somehow if it's relevant. And as a former computational linguist, I can tell you that just trying to look at the language and interpret it semantically is very, very hard to do. But there are things that you can measure very easily that tend to correlate with what you want to know. So for example, the people behind Google came up with a very clever way to measure if it was a good quality website, at least initially, and that was something called PageRank, and that's how many links that people are making into this website as a measure of how good a website it is, or how well it matches keywords. So you can see from these diagrams that you get this big elevation in your page rank score if lots of people are linking to you. But what happens is people know this who are building web pages, and they want their web pages to rise to the top of the score. So they start building their web pages. Instead of focusing on the quality of what they're writing, they might, for example, ask someone to link into their page, or do this thing called keyword stuffing, where they think about what keywords people are actually looking for and repeat them over and over again in their page. And again, what happens, the result of this is that the more people catch on to those metrics, the more the correlation between that metric and the actual importance, quality, and relevance of the page begins to break down. And the internet is the worst place because of it. Well, we have the same thing going on in the ketogenic world sometimes. Here's an example. So yes, I want to acknowledge that exogenous ketones can have some benefit in certain situations of performance or medical uses even. But if you're just using exogenous ketones in order to try to make up for having a basically cruddy diet, you shouldn't expect to get the same kind of benefits that you hear about or read about when you read these studies about ketogenic diets, because you've made the bottom line be about your blood ketone level instead of what your diet is made up with, and now the correlation is going to break down. You're not going to get the same benefits. So I'd like to play a little game for the rest of this talk. And what we're going to do is I'm going to bring up a bunch of different measures, and we're going to think about what kind of flaws might be operating when you use these measures to inform your dietary choices. So first of all, the feature selection bias, and all of these are kind of related, but the feature selection bias is whether or not the choices that go into the equation are actually revealing or representing an underlying theory that doesn't maybe stand up to scrutiny, or that has inherent biases in it. Or number two, you've got a metric that seems like it measures the right things, but when you look at it, you realize that that's actually because of a correlation, and you're not measuring what you really want to know. And insofar as you've got that situation, then you can look at Goodhart's law and what happens if you game it, and does it destroy the value of the metric in the first place. So let's start with nutrient density. Nutrient density is a way to make a score, and I love that because it's good to be able to put some kind of numerical kind of precision on what you're measuring. But in fact, when you look at it more deeply, the first problem turns out that the formula isn't very precise. So let's walk through the formula. It's very simple, so stay with me, it's just 2 steps. The nutrient density comes from, first of all, summing up the nutritious elements. That sigma, don't let it bug you, it's just a fancy symbol for summing up. Nothing serious. So you're summing up the nutritious elements, and then you're dividing by the sum of either the elements that don't have nutrition or that actually are anti-nutritious. And this is great, right? Because it's everything you want in a score. When the nutritional elements are more, then the score goes up, and things that are taking away from its nutrition make the score go down. So that's perfect. But it depends on what your choices are for the numerator and denominator. So guess what's chosen for the bottom? This is feature selection bias operating. Well, what goes on the bottom, and the most widely used definition of nutrient density, is calories. The top isn't well defined yet. We'll come back to that. But what the bottom means is that energy is actually being penalized by this formula. Well, energy is arguably the primary point of eating. So not only does it penalize something that you might think is a sort of empty source of calories like sugar, but it penalizes fat. It even penalizes protein, even though normally we wouldn't expect or want to be using protein to derive energy from. Protein does have a defined caloric value, and so that goes into the formula. So that brings us to the question of why we're eating in the first place. We need food for three things. We need energy. That's why we sometimes call food fuel, right? We need energy, and I really can't emphasize this enough. I think it gets underplayed. We also need structural material. This comes primarily from protein, also from fat a little bit, and even from micronutrients. And we need small amounts of these chemicals, micronutrients, that are used in chemical reactions that make your body work. It's what makes us alive. So when you go back to the formula, you find that what nutrient density has done is actually pitted one thing that we need, micronutrients, against something else that we need, which is energy. Why would anybody do that? Well, I think it's because there's this unquestioned, implicit assumption that it's important for your health to restrict energy. So when you hear the term nutrient density, I want you to recognize that half of the equation is based on the idea that restricting energy is important for health. And actually, plant-based diet promoters love the nutrient density metric because it actually lines up with all of the plant-based diet biases. So anything that vilifies energy will bias against sugar, but it's going to bias against high fat, it's going to bias against high protein, and that is to say all or most animal foods. And on the contrary, it will put anything that's low fat and high in fiber to have a very big score. So it's actually the perfect metric for a low fat plant-based diet. But this pyramid's missing a base. Here's the true base. There's nothing more nutrient dense than a vitamin and mineral supplement. So we've got this very ironic situation where if you take the score to its logical conclusion, you get something that I arguably wouldn't even call food, but you can sell it. So that's our Goodhart's application here. If you're aiming for the highest possible nutrient density, you end up with a vitamin pill and something that misses a very basic requirement of food, which is energy. Is it solvable? Well, you might think that you could use something more neutral on the bottom, maybe like weight or mass. So you could say, how about if we were measuring micronutrients per gram? It sounds reasonable, but then you get these weird effects. So you're going to get evaporated milk, for example, being more nutrient dense than milk. And there's a sense in which it's kind of true, right? It has more nutrients per gram, but that's hardly useful for a food choice heuristic. This is a picture of jerky that I made. It's high fat jerky that I made from thinly sliced ribeye. So if you eat jerky instead of cooked, hydrated steak form, it would be a very bizarre argument to make that it's more nutritious, even though it's technically, if you're using grams, it's more nutrient dense. It just means you're going to have to drink more water, which, if you think about it, water is also a nutritional need, and it's a very heavy nutrient. Okay, so we could try something else. What about volume? That also has weird effects that maybe you don't intend. So for example, air is going to score really highly. So popcorn is going to come out as less nutrient dense than corn, which maybe it is, but as just adding air shouldn't really change the calculation. But fiber is also going to get penalized, and I think that's really interesting, and I kind of like that. For one thing, it's opposite to some weight loss advice that I've seen that I find really perplexing. There's actually a whole diet plan based on putting volume, in this case in the numerator, and calories in the denominator. And so the idea is that if you eat a higher volume of food, you'll feel fuller, and it'll trick your body into miscalibrating how much energy came in. So I have to say that from an evolutionary perspective, it really does seem like nonsense. Because if you have an organism that isn't well tuned enough to figure out somehow through its body sensors the difference between volume and actual energy, I don't think those genes are really going to get passed along. And not to mention that anybody with a digestive disorder is going to feel worse on a diet that targets high volume. In fact, if you know anything about the PKD, the paleo-ketogenic diet from the Paleo-Medicina Clinic in Hungary, one of the things that they talk about in their diet, which is all animal-based and very high fat, is that it's a low-volume diet, and this is actually supposed to be a benefit. All right, well, enough about the denominator problems. We've also got big problems in the numerator. There's no real guidance about how to sum up micronutrients. You can't just add vitamin C to iodine any more than you can add apples to oysters. So I have to give the egg board extra points for creativity here. I took this off the website, and they just have a count for how many nutrients eggs have. So they say one egg has 13 essential vitamins and minerals in varying amounts, high quality protein and antioxidants, all for 70 calories. But I find this really, really funny because, well, half an egg also has 13 essential vitamins, but it only has 35 calories. So it turns out that the less egg you eat, the more nutrient dense it is. We can be smarter than that. Here's an idea. It's also got problems, but at first blush, it seems like it might work. So you could take a whole collection of nutrients, like everything that has an RDA, for example, and use the percent of RDA of all of them. So maybe work it out. So if you get to 100% of the RDA of all things, then it's a score of 100, and you take some kind of average. Now, I have to say, I have a whole lot of criticism about the concept of RDA itself, especially in the context of low-carb diet. And I won't go into it here because I've already given a talk about that. It was at the Carnivore Conference in Boulder last year. So please look that up if you're interested. But let's take some examples. So I pulled this from the USDA database. It's a hamburger with some stuff on it. And I think it shows that there are some unrecoverable problems here. So we've got about 1,000 calories in this serving. And the total we would get for micronutrients, if we used that score the way I was envisioning it in the last slide, is we'd get a 37 or 38, okay? But that number by itself gives us no real direction. It doesn't tell us that if you try to make up for it, like suppose you ate 3 of them, because then you're getting 38 times 3, you should get 100, right? But it's not going to make up for the fact, it's never going to get you enough vitamin D, for example, or vitamin A or vitamin C. So that's a problem. Here's another food, it's really nutrient dense. It's pork kidneys, and there's only about 200 calories in this cup. And the score on the RDA side would be about 60%. But that average is really being pulled up by 3 particular nutrients that go off the chart. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see that, oh, I'm sorry, I went back. Here we go. If you zoom in, you can see that not only is it being pulled up by these 3 nutrients, but selenium is off the charts for the safe upper limit. And that can be really serious. I've met a woman a couple of years ago who had a very serious problem when she was trying to get her RDAs and was using Brazil nuts to eat enough selenium. And she actually started having neurological problems that her doctor couldn't solve, the specialist couldn't solve. And it wasn't until she made the connection between what she was eating and the possibility of an overdose that she realized that selenium was causing all this debilitation that she almost had scary interventions for. So we've really got to be careful. All right, one thing that you could do, like these authors here, is break out your nutrient density score per nutrient. And I will zoom in on this in a second, but one thing to notice is that now we've just lost our goal. We had this goal of having a simple heuristic for choosing food. And this gets really complicated. When it comes to micronutrients, I don't think there's any way around that. Okay, so let's zoom in. First, a couple of points. These are 418 kilojoule samples. That sounds arbitrary, but that's just because they wanted to use metric, but they wanted to use 100 calorie samples. So that's just the equivalent of 100 calories. And secondly, notice that for these categories, we're comparing 18 different vegetables, probably selected to maximize micronutrient variety, against 4 samples of meat, which are probably all quite similar. The chart has seafood and it has milk, but they're separated out so that meat is more uniform. And there's no representation of organs or eggs. So if we look at one of the nutrients that they're looking at, a row, this one is for vitamin A, but it's lumping together beta-carotene and retinol, which have different properties, which I also can't get into today. And then they're ranked for vitamin A, even though carotenoids and retinol have different properties. 1 is the least nutrient dense across the 7 categories, and 7 is the most nutrient dense. So we've excluded liver and eggs from our meat category, separated seafood from lean meat. We haven't dealt with the issue that fat-soluble vitamins are actually found in fat, and here we've stripped off the fat. And then we've put all the vegetables together so that the vegetable category doesn't suffer any competition within its own category. We can choose whichever vegetable wins for each nutrient. Well, that's a feature selection bias. I rearranged the data so we could look at it in a different way. Here we have the blue being iron and the green being vitamin A. And this is where you'd fall on the RDA, with that line being getting to 100 if you ate all of your calories from the food in question. How can vegetables be winning an iron and vitamin A? Only because of these biases that I've mentioned, where you are lumping all the vegetables together, taking out the most nutrient-dense animal foods, taking out the fat, and not paying attention to the differences between, for example, heme iron and non-heme iron, and retinol and beta-carotene. Feature selection bias. It's pretty aggressive, but this time it's more sophisticated. The feature selection has been complicated by the choice of categorization. But if you think that's bad, there's something way worse along those lines. I'm going to talk about NOVA, the NOVA food classification, and how they use guilt by association to prove what they assume. So let's go through an example first of how this works. We're going to prove that Robin is a boy's name. In case you don't know, in English, Robin is a popular name both for girls and for boys. So suppose we have a task. We want to do something terrible, like make an algorithm to predict what pronoun someone prefers to use based on his or her name. Note that this is considered very bad because, of course, you're supposed to ask the person and not just make an assumption. But let's suppose we're going to try to do that, okay? So we've got, for data, we've got a collection of pairs of names and the pronoun that happened to be used with it. So for example, maybe we had 123 cases of Angela and they all came with a she, and we had 42 cases of Charlie, and the vast majority of them were a he, a few of them were a she, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what are we going to do to try to make an algorithm that will guess correctly the gender of people by their names? Well, here's a method that I think you'll agree is not that great, but it could work. So we divide the names randomly into two equal halves of categories, and then we see which half is more likely to be he. And of course, randomly, one of them is going to be more likely to be he. And if it's not statistically significant, then shuffle them again and do it until it is. And so then eventually we will get a category and we can say, all of the names in that half should predict male. Note that if I were a data scientist working for you and I presented this solution, you should question your decision to hire me. All right, here's something slightly better. So without peeking, we're gonna, at the data results, right? We're gonna select all the names that you're sure about and put them in the category you think is correct. And then all the ones that you're not sure about, let's just randomly distribute them into the categories sort of similarly to what we did before. And now, well, look, we'll use those categories to make predictions, and most of the time they're correct. So we must have done the right categories, right? We should easily see that there's something very wrong with this method, even though it got us a good result in terms of our predictions. Okay, here's a third method. Without peeking, again, we're going to select all the names that we're sure about, and we're going to put them in the category we think is correct. And additionally, we're going to take Robin, and we're going to stick it in the he category because maybe we know about Robin Hood and Sir Robin in the Knights of the Round Table. And then we'll randomly distribute the others and observe that our predictions are usually correct. And there we have proven that Robin is a boy's name. No self-respecting data scientist would ever do such a thing, right? Okay, now let's talk about NOVA, the food classification system. Here we have from their publication, their examples of good foods, unprocessed foods along the top, and the ultra-processed products below. By their nature, they are unhealthy and should be grouped together and avoided, it says. How did they come up with these categories? Well, they used their intuitions to put together a heuristic. So we see the same kind of pattern. Robin is a boy and burgers are a health risk. I've underlined in their description of how they chose the ultra-processed category things that I think are a little bit iffy. I'm not sure how they got in there. Carbonation, is that necessarily unhealthy? What about packaging? I've seen packaged boiled eggs in the store. Should I avoid those? Spreads is very general. Cocoa drinks, it could mean some things that I would never touch. It could mean something that I wouldn't mind at all. And definitely burgers, I have a strong objection to being in that classification. But then what they've done is they made these categories and then they set out a whole research agenda using these categories pre-formed to test either epidemiologically or even in randomized controlled trials to find out if giving people the foods that come from the unprocessed category versus foods from the processed category are going to have better or worse health results. And then they use the results of that to say, look, our classification was correct. It's exactly the same as the thing we did with proving Robin as a boy. So just in 2020, there are at least 6, I stopped when I got to 6 of these studies that are using this categorization system and making conclusions that the categorization is correct. So here's 2 more. And here's 2 more. And here's an excerpt from one of them. It says, there is now a considerable body of evidence supporting the use of ultra-processed foods as a scientific concept to assess the healthiness of foods within the context of dietary patterns and to help inform the development of dietary guidelines and nutrition policy actions. As a data scientist, I call BS. They have not proven that any one of the foods within their categories is actually a culprit. And yet, I'm sure that in the coming years, people will point to these studies and say, look, it's been proven. You might argue with it as a theory, but we have the proof. And I say that we don't. All right. enough of that. Let's look at something else. So, even if you don't believe that calories are the key to controlling your weight, that you can't necessarily control your weight by controlling calories directly, you probably still would agree that if you lose fat, that has to mean that a calorie deficit happened, right? One of the strongest advantages that a low-carb diet has over low-calorie diets for weight control is that it seems that something about the composition of the food makes it so you stop feeling hungry at a lower level of calories. This is what protein leverage is all about. And to be fair, it's what nutrient density is all about, right? The idea is you are trying to find something that explains why you're still hungry. And that something is your body's still looking for nutrients, or your body's still looking for protein. So we need the material to make ourselves out of. We need energy to fuel all of the chemical reactions that make us alive, not just lumps of flesh. And we need small amounts of these special chemicals to take part in those reactions. The most charitable understanding of nutrient density says you're going to stay hungry until you get those needs met. And if you don't want to overeat, you need to get those needs met first. And it's the same story with protein leverage. The problem is that the evidence doesn't fit it as well as it might look at first blush. So protein leverage is a scientific version of this idea. It comes from an extremely important and influential paper from Simpson and Raubenheimer in 2004. And it's a great paper. The idea is animals eat until they get enough protein. In other words, protein is what's driving satiety. This is the most important concept of the whole paper. The idea is people need a certain amount of protein, and if the food that they're eating has too much energy compared to protein, they're just going to have to eat more of it and therefore overeat energy, that is calories, in order to get their protein needs met. So this graph contains a prediction. It says if we change the diet so the foods in it have a higher proportion of protein compared to energy, then they'll get their needs met with less energy, and voila, we have weight loss. Watch out for feature selection bias, because there's this little problem right here. The authors are treating carbohydrate and fat as equivalent because all they see when they look there is energy. And remember, this hypothesis is about what creates satiety. Do carbohydrates and fat have the same effect on satiety? Well, no, not at all. It doesn't matter how many times this protein leverage effect has been replicated in humans and in other animals, because when you test it in the low-carb, high-fat situation, it doesn't replicate. Let's look at that. Here's another really important paper. It's not important for that reason. The authors were using a mouse model, and it was a kind of proof of concept of how a ketogenic diet changes metabolism in healthy, extraordinarily healthy ways. What we're interested in from the paper is not those important outcomes, but something that's buried in there that's relevant to our question. So they used 4 different diets. They had regular chow. Well, 3 of them were ad libitum, meaning they could eat as much of the food as they wanted, and that's the ones we want to look at. So they had the regular chow, they had a ketogenic diet, and the diet that they call high fat, which of course means high fat and high carb, as we talked about earlier. And what do they notice about the ad libitum diets? What they noticed is that after this initial adjustment period of about a day, the mice were all eating the same amount of calories every day after, regardless of what diet they were using. And what were the compositions of those diets? Well, if we're looking at the proportion just of protein, which is what we're interested in here, the chow had about 27% of calories from protein. The high-fat, high-carb diet had 24% calories from protein, and the ketogenic diet had only 5% protein. So what happened to protein leverage? If the hypothesis were going to hold in this case, these mice would have had to have eaten 5 times as many calories, but they didn't. So here's what I think happened. First of all, we confounded energy from carbohydrates with energy from fat. Protein does promote satiety more than carbs. But how does it compare to fat? First of all, let's just get this out of the way. Satiety means how long it takes after eating that you're hungry again. And that's to be contrasted with satiation. It's often mixed up with that. Satiation means how much you have to eat before you want to stop eating because you've had enough, or you can't eat another bite, depending on the context. All right, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that satiety is mostly a reflection of your body's perception of how much access it has to nutrients at any given time. So you're hungry again when that access is dwindling. And that's the result of certain signals. So there are two kinds of ways that we can get signals that would impact our body's perception of how much energy or nutrients we have access to. So the first is responding to what's coming in. So there are many hormones that are signaling this, but I'm going to just focus on two. CCK, cholecystokinin, let's just say CCK, not CC, and ghrelin. They're both produced in the gastrointestinal tract, and CCK suppresses hunger because its presence is basically a signal that food came in. And ghrelin stimulates appetite, so eating normally suppresses it. What we would like to know is what happens to these signals when you eat meals containing different macronutrients in the context of a low-carb diet, really. But unfortunately, as far as I know, we don't have that evidence. We don't have that condition. It's never been tested. The best that I know of are a couple of studies looking at people who were overnight fasted and got these macronutrients in isolation or almost in isolation. So there's this one study on CCK, and it's looking at absolute values. And you can see that with carbohydrates, CCK, which should remember it's going to suppress our appetite, went up a little bit. With protein, it went up way, 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 way more, in the hundreds compared to the 9 of the carbs. And the fat is very close to the same value, but even here it has a little bit of an edge. And then there's a similar kind of study that was for ghrelin, and what it showed, ghrelin should increase your appetite. So with carbs, you do get this reduction in ghrelin, and in fat you get a similar, the same number, the same percent reduction in ghrelin. But look at the protein. The protein actually increased ghrelin. It seems like it's actually making people more hungry when you've got that protein in isolation in this overnight fasted condition. And one thing that isn't shown very well in this kind of graphic is about how long the effect lasts. So at 3 hours, the carb and the protein effects have gone back to baseline, but the effect of lowering ghrelin from the fat is still actually going strongly at 3 hours. So of course, what we really want to know is what happens with ketogenic. I don't want to step outside the bounds of the evidence. And ideally, we want to take the ketogenic condition and find out what happens when you mix fat and protein at different ratios. But we don't have that. But I think that the results are at least highly suggestive. So besides what the signals from incoming food, we also get signals that are depending on our access to our energy. So it turns out that you can only get fat out of your fat cells at a rate-limited amount, and that has implications. So what affects the rate of fat release? Well, at least these things, and maybe others, but how much fat mass you have. The more fat cells you have, the more fat you have. That rate limit is only going to apply per gram of mass. So the more mass that you have, the more fat access you have. Your insulin levels are going to affect how much the fat is going to be released from those cells, and likewise how insulin sensitive that fat tissue is. So if you and I have the same insulin levels, but my fat tissue is more insulin sensitive than yours, then those insulin levels are going to stop. They're going to make the amount of fat that comes out of my fat cells lower than the amount of fat that comes out of yours. So if you're looking at just a simple calories in, calories out perspective, it says that if I'm eating only protein or I'm completely fasting, if I'm taking in no fat, then my body fat's going to be used for energy, and the only thing that's preventing it from coming out completely is that the amount of butter that I'm chugging, right? But I'm here to say that the adipose tissue might say otherwise. There might just be a limit to how much I can get out of my fat stores. And if that's the case, then I really want to add more fat so that I can get the energy that I need to get through the day. It's not helping me to lower fat beyond that level. We have a word for what happens when you can't get your energy needs met with fat or carbohydrate, and you try to meet all those needs with protein. Historically, what's happened to people who are lean and had limited access to stored fat just because of the fat mass part is that they didn't only become ill with symptoms like headache and diarrhea, but they became ravenous specifically for fat. Now, like I said, these are lean people, and so that explains why, but it doesn't take too much imagination to suppose that there may be some situations, people living among us who are fat, but because of some kind of metabolic condition, maybe their insulin levels, maybe something immunological, the rate of fat that's coming out of their fat stores limits them, and they're going to be hungry, and just telling them not to eat any fat is not helpful. So this is a little more subtle, but look at the assumption that's in this graph. We've got 14% protein is that baseline. And yeah, it may be true that if you're not getting enough protein, 14% is really quite little, and you increase your protein percent, it may well be that this will decrease your need to eat more. But there's got to come a point where more protein is no longer helpful, and in that case, it means that when you get there, you're gonna see this kind of opposite symmetric thing where you're going to keep eating until you can get enough fat. So when you think about protein leverage, you should also be thinking about fat leverage. And it all depends on where you are on that spectrum of needs. However, there's one more confounder that I'd like to talk about. Here's some scrumptious images that I found when I was looking up keto fat bomb. And of course, I have nothing against using recipes to try to help you meet your dietary needs. But what I want you to focus on here is when you're looking at this, is what you see fat. Is that the only thing that you see in these pictures? If I took these things out of my diet, I was eating them regularly, and then I started losing weight, is it fair for me to say, oh, it was the fat, I was eating too many calories? Or is it possible that there's some other factor at play here? I mean, for one thing, some of these have dairy in it, and there could be a response to dairy. There are many potential issues that have been brought up, including effects on insulin, casomorphins, which is a kind of opiate, inflammation from subclinical food sensitivities. On the other hand, we've got things with nuts in here. Nuts have anti-nutrients. But another fact about nuts that's interesting is that they're high in polyunsaturated fats. And I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, but there's an interesting hypothesis circulating that there are properties of different fatty acid profiles that can affect how insulin sensitive your fat cells are, and ultimately affect satiety. So this is just a graphic from a study that's being discussed on this website where the calories were the same in these mice, but if you keep everything the same except increase the linoleic acid, a specific kind of polyunsaturated fatty acid, these mice were getting much fatter on the same calories. So not only is it a category error to lump fat and carbs together, but it's a category error to lump fat and fat together. Let's look at one more example. Many people, especially for some reason when they hear about carnivore diets, turn to this notion that we should be eating nose to tail or the whole animal. And I see three different lines of reasoning around this. One of them is actually a kind of reasonable question. It's based on counting micronutrients. The fact is that animal-based foods are a better source of almost all micronutrients than plants, both in terms of their quantity and their bioavailability. But it's only true if you count liver. And I'm not going to discuss further about whether we should be worrying about this. It's a fair case to talk about, but I also want to point out that there are many long-term carnivores who have been eating a carnivore diet without organs, and they don't seem to have the deficiencies that we would expect them to have if this were a real problem. And I think we should take it seriously and try to figure out if there's some sparing effects that might be going on. I talked about this a lot in the other talk, the RDA talk that I mentioned. Another way that this idea comes up is from kind of a literal version, but please not completely literally, of that you are what you eat. So you're trying to construct a whole body. It seems reasonable maybe to assume that you should need whole bodies to get all the materials, right? But then the question comes up, well, which animals, which parts? And please don't be mean, but my body doesn't have the same proportions as a cow. So we don't want to fall into some silly notions like you need to eat organs or the components of them to the same proportion that is in the animal's body, or is even that's in your own body. And you certainly don't need, for example, to eat brains to make brains, or eat kidneys to make kidneys. As any good vegan will tell you, there are animals that don't have to eat meat to make their bodies because, well, it turns out they have the power to transform leaves and grass into meat. Well, that's great for them. We don't have that ability, but it doesn't mean that we literally have to get every body part from an equivalent body part. And by the way, if you've ever come across this idea, well, how do you think the cow got her nutrients? You should be able to do it just the same way. You might point out by asking where the grass got their nutrients and suggest that she or he stands with their feet in the soil. Biochemistry matters. And also remember that the rate of use of each of these components isn't the same as the proportion that we find in our bodies. So we go through a lot more energy than anything else. We don't need a full body's worth of protein every day or any micronutrient. We recycle them, and every nutrient is its own case and how much is being used, and it depends on your health and what your metabolic state is. And of course, there's some parts that I really don't want to eat. If I say, well, of course I didn't mean the fur when I said eat the whole animal, then you realize how arbitrary it is. How do you know that they didn't mean, how do you know that you have to eat the nose but not the fur? Where are you drawing this line? I was brought up even in the plant world to believe in eating the whole thing. We ate the whole potato because that's, the peels are where the vitamins are, right? When I was 9, I stayed overnight at my best friend's house, and she was from Poland, and her mother was making breakfast, some potato latkes, and I asked her why she was peeling the potatoes, and she wrinkled her nose and said, potato peels are for pigs. Well, it took me about 30 years to really appreciate and get on board with that. That's where the toxins are, and even if it is where the nutrients are, maybe pigs have a better capacity to deal with those, I think, than humans do. They're more fully omnivorous than we are. But she knew this from long tradition. And tradition is another one of those reasonable things about eating nose to tail. Practically everywhere in the world except the US eats organs traditionally, and maybe that's because it's actually important. We shouldn't rule that out. But remember, there's more to more to tradition than necessity, right? We have bread is also a traditional food, and we have maybe traditions that were based on not wasting food. It's better to eat than not to eat. Sometimes there may be a superstition involved, a ritual aspect of eating a certain type of food. And in some cases, there are functions that are maybe not needed anymore. So take, for example, cured meat, where we needed that. There's a long history in Europe, for example, of curing meat in order to preserve it. So I absolutely don't think that cured meat is harmful. I think that's a ridiculous assertion that's going around. But by the same token, I wouldn't argue that we need to include it just because it's a long tradition and you'd be missing out on something because of it. I think the function of cured is quite obvious in this case. We don't know the function of everything that we ate traditionally. So this leaves us as a kind of impasse, right? We wanted simple rules, and there's nothing wrong with that. No one wants to have to think about food all the time and figure everything out. But the thing is, give me any rule and I'll show you a way to break it. This is an example of what happens when our rules are too general. Both of these foods are considered paleo, and I don't think they're the same kind of diet. And actually, I would argue that the one on the left isn't really paleo either, but I won't go into that. And this is no less a problem with the carnivore diet that, as you know, I'm a big advocate for. The rules can be too specific. The benefits of a carnivore diet aren't explained by the idea that plants are just inherently bad and meat is inherently good. I highly doubt that. I'm pretty much certain that anyone, including me, who thrives on a carnivore diet can tolerate on some plant or other if they wanted to figure out which ones those were. Most of us are very likely over-restricted. Now, of course, there's a reason for the rule, a great reason. Plant elimination is a great tool for quickly getting to feeling good for a lot of people. And all plants are potential suspects because of the biological defenses that they use. But it doesn't really mean that any plant in any dose is going to hurt you. When you're new to something or you lack confidence, there's a temptation to, sometimes it seems like an advantage to just say, just tell me what to do, give me a rule. But it's not too much to ask that you or your clients, if you're helping people engage with the process. It turns out that the most successful people are usually those who take responsibility and commit to understanding the basis of what's happening, and that makes it easier to avoid pitfalls. Of course, that doesn't mean you have to do it alone. You can have consultants, have people who help you. But just because something works in theory doesn't mean you aren't trying hard enough. If you understand the basis, you can tell if you're doing it right. But even the best theories often have outliers in response. There may be a legitimate reason that something doesn't work for you. This is true even if something worked for you in the past. All of these rules are just ideas. And the best ones are really good default starting points, but none of them are the ultimate be-all and end-all of nutrition. So the point of this analysis is not to abandon heuristics. We need them. The point is, it's possible that the metric you're using has a built-in bias that you didn't mean to embrace, that you're not fully on board with, or that the set of features it focuses on blinds you to other useful interpretations. So if you're doing everything right and you're struggling, sometimes it's helpful to take a step back and change your perspective. And I hope that these principles will be useful to you in those situations. So thank you very much for tuning in. Hello.
Hi, I think there's a 30-second delay, so we might have to just. Okay. All right, great. Okay, so I actually have a question at the point at which you said thank you. And that question is, how do you be scientific with yourself?
How am I scientific with myself? What a great question. I think it's really hard to be scientific with yourself. I have some great role models in my own life and community, and I really want to mention Siobhan Huggins and Dave Feldman, who I have watched personally be so extremely diligent about running N=1 experiments to find out what the exact parameters that they're changing are, and taking all kinds of blood work. And historically, I haven't done a lot of that because the factors are just so complex. Even when you do go to that length to do a careful self-experiment, you're a different person at every point in time. And it's also, feature selection bias in particular is so hard to avoid, because as soon as you see something that you think is going to have an effect, it's really hard not to pay attention to that in maybe an overly biased way. So, for example, I started a carnivore diet, I guess, 11 years ago, and at that time, I didn't try to keep calories the same. So definitely there are things that changed, like my protein levels probably went up, my calories may have gone up, my carnitine levels may have gone up, uh, and my appetite probably changed, and I just responded to that. And I didn't even try to address that, because I feel like if I'm going to make a change, I want to let it kind of naturally take its course and see what follows from one basic step. And the problem is it might not be as replicable in other people, but on the other hand, you don't need replicability in other people to make decisions about your own life. So all of that is to say, maybe I'm not the most scientific in my own life, but I'm very pragmatic. I wanted to insert one more thing at the end there. I had a slide that had the Patreon logo on it, and it wasn't just to suggest that people support me, although I'm happy if you do, but I meant to say out loud that thank you extends to the Patreon supporters I already have.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we'll just revisit the edit. So just for those who are watching us on YouTube, you can leave your questions on YouTube chat for Amber. I will pick them up and pass it on to her. In the meanwhile, I had two questions, and maybe for the audience, who is out there and who's sort of chatting about, all that you've been talking about, including your supporters out there. Maybe this is very obvious, but for some of us who are not necessarily very tuned into your work, I think the two questions that came up for me during the talk were, uh, one, of course, being is that a lot of heuristics are informed by this sort of pressure for weight loss. And the other point that you pointed out, which is tradition, because there's a huge role of tradition in nutrition. How have you gone through this journey yourself, with respect to these two aspects or these two criteria?
Well, when I started the low carb diet a very long time ago, and when I started the carnivore diet also a fairly long time ago, the motivating factors for me were weight loss in both cases. I fully admit that it was a vanity-driven kind of change, and it was only after I discovered what the change would actually do to my health that I decided to stay with them for such a long term. I guess I don't know what I would have done if something that I tried caused me to have weight loss, but at the same time was harming my health in other ways. It seems like a very difficult thing, because the social pressure is immense to be thin, and you can't always see ill health. Like if I'm suffering from depression, that's really a private thing most of the time. It's going to affect the people in my immediate life, but from a public perspective or from work, for example, people might not know if I'm going home and crying myself to sleep. And so I think I've been very lucky in that I have a low tolerance for things that don't feel good. Now, I do have a strong willpower and I'm willing to do things, but I'm not willing to feel bad for a long time. Um, and I'm sorry, what was the second part?
The second question was about tradition,
Oh,
and I don't
tradition.
know, yeah, and I don't know if you want to expand that to, even things like dominant paradigm and even dogma for that matter.
Yeah, so when I first went low carb, I think I was able to maintain at least family type traditions and find low carb versions of meals that would have been traditional in my family. a lot of my traditions come. My mother's mother was English, born in England, and didn't come to Canada until she was an adult. So I I can remember my first low carb Christmas, and I of course had the turkey and things like Brussels sprouts, and I just omitted the the potatoes, and I made a low carb dessert, and I felt like I was able to sort of simulate all of the same things on a low carb diet. But when I went on a carnivore diet, well, it wouldn't be traditional for me at all because my family was actually vegetarian. And so the only real crossover would be eggs and dairy. And I, I kind of abandoned any pretense at trying to replicate my old ways, but I became aware of other traditions. So, for example, I had never learned how to cook a good steak. I was really good at making hummus, but not steak necessarily. And I learned about cured meats, as I've mentioned. And in recent years, I've really gotten into uh, the ironically, I guess maybe the organ side of things. So I have learned how to prepare liver pate and to cook brains, and I've gotten into a lot of lamb. I go to Mediterranean, sort of Middle Eastern uh, groceries and have been really interested in their cooking because that's foreign to me but traditional for them. And so it's a great source of knowledge, both culinarily and nutritionally, I think.
Right. So there are a couple of questions. Let me try to club a few. Travis Statman asks, do we have any good studies on just fat and protein and measures of satiety? He's asking this question in the context of the lookup that he's been doing on satiety.
No, I don't think there are, because everything that we have that is about that either happens in the context of a mixed meal with a high carbohydrate diet. Um, well, that's the main problem, right? So the two studies that I showed were the closest that I could find, and even then, they're not in a ketogenic state at all. They'd been fasting overnight and then isolated those things. So I would really love to see in the ketogenic context where you're just eating, where you're just eating fat and protein, then what is the effect of changing those ratios? Because I don't think it's well established at all. And there are a lot of claims, I think, on both sides that one is strictly better than the other. And I do think that the evidence is highly suggestive that fat provides more both satiation and satiety, but it might depend on what kind of protein and what kind of fat, and there's a lot to explore there. It's kind of exciting.
Right. There's another question, or actually, there's a comment. Okay, let me try to put both of them together. Someone with the handle Logical Links points out, saying when people are sick, and he refers to sick in terms of infection, why do you think some have the propensity to gain and others lose? Do you see fat gain as a protective mechanism that is eventually broken?
Well, it's a great question. So I think sickness can have different effects on appetite, for example. So there are known situations where if you are sick, your appetite will go down, and that itself could be an explanation for weight loss or potentially not getting the nutrients you need, maybe if it's gastrointestinal. Although I did, just a quick tangent, I did hear a recent study, maybe I can tell you the name because I don't remember it off the top of my head, about they were trying to figure out why appetite is suppressed in sickness with rodents, and so they took rodents and made them sick in various ways, like with lipopolysaccharides or listeria, and they naturally had a reduction in appetite, and then they force fed them, and they found out that that would caused them not to survive. Like the rate of survival went down drastically, unless it was only fat or only protein, and then it didn't disrupt. So there's some interesting things about what is meant by losing weight. If you're on a high carb diet and you suddenly need to stop eating, that might be different from if you're on a high fat diet. As to why people might gain weight, my best hypothesis about that, and I again want to call out Siobhan Huggins for promoting this idea and explaining behind the science behind it more, is that insulin itself can be elevated by the immune system as a response that's required for repair. And once insulin is higher, no matter what the reason for that was, you're probably going to have all these other metabolic effects that are secondary to that insulin being higher that could result in weight gain. And so that might be the answer to why some people gain weight and others lose in that context.
Great. There are a couple of comments, again, by logical links on the question of design, or I would think experimental design. And there are two comments that that logical links makes, which is it is hard to compare diets isocalorically, isomacronutriently, and isovolumetrically. There's always a difference in design. We need to see fat protein ad lib studies in the future. Is there anything that you'd like to add to this, or else we could move to the next question?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that you can't, when the variables are all interdependent like that, you can't change one without changing the other. So it's extremely complicated, and there's always going to be, no matter how you design it, someone will rightly complain that there's another factor changed, and I don't see any good way around that.
Right. There's a question by Paul Melzer. Or before that, Logical Links says thank you to you for the extremely nuanced answer. Paul Melzer has a question on what are your thoughts on raw versus cooked in regards to nutrient change, degradation, or otherwise?
It depends. There are some nutrients that don't seem to be affected by cooking of meat, and others that do. For example, vitamin C is destroyed by enough heat, and there's another one that it's an amino acid that has just slipped my mind. I'll probably think of it as soon as we turn off. A very important one. Anyway, I think we don't really know to what degree that's a problem, but one thing that is also important to take into account is how much it is cooked. So there can even be advantages, like sometimes cooking will help break down and make things more easy to digest, and in other cases you might argue that the enzymes in the raw are easier to digest. And again, it's something that is a good case for new study that we don't know enough about, because raw has been so important for controlling pathogens, and there's obviously a trade-off there too. I know that a lot of people have told me or told people publicly that when they started eating more raw, they felt better than they had even well cooked. Maybe there's a happy medium by cooking to medium. I don't know. Depends on the nutrient.
Right. I think there were two comments on that, whether you're referring to taurine or Pottingers.
Taurine, that was the one I couldn't think of. Thank you.
All right. There is a related question, which is from Frederick, about is ruminant muscle meat only enough, or is there an absolute need for incorporating organs like livers, oysters, egg yolks, among other things? Also, does raw versus well-done meat influence this factor?
Great question. I think the one thing that we can say definitively is that all of those things are highly nutritious and have nutrients. So if you're worried about it and you want to cover all your bases, you can easily do that by adding those foods. What we can't really tell quite so well at this point is how often or how much we would need of those things in the long term. We definitely have examples of people who don't eat organs and seem to be doing fine. Whether there is some kind of very slow depletion of something, like I think it's quite well established that in the vegan community there are deficiencies that take a long time to develop, and we just don't know enough. But I would also suggest that the metabolic conditions of being on a ketogenic meat-only diet are so different that the RDAs themselves, I don't think they apply directly, at least in all cases. And so how much and how often is really an open question. And it also might depend on, for example, what you're doing in your life, how healthy you are. If you have some condition that is using up some nutrient more than others, then maybe you're going to need some more infusion of those nutrients from your diet than another person who doesn't have the same stressor in that way.
Great. So there is a question from Samuel Nara, which is, I would like to know how can I find out if I'm eating enough micronutrients? Is there a good source of information for every food separately? I think I had a similar question of like, how do you measure what matters and how do you know what really matters?
So that, I think, comes back to the N=1 experimentation. One thing that you can definitely do is, for example, if you're on a carnivore diet and you're not incorporating any organs or special foods for nutrients, you can eat that way for a while, and it's going to be very subjective, although you can get some lab work. Vitamin panels are complicated because, for example, if you're high in some nutrient, it might mean that you're not using it efficiently. So it's a whole other can of worms. But you could, for example, eat without them and then add them and see how you feel and see if that changes over time. I would share an experience I had early on in my first or second year of eating a carnivore diet, where I decided to supplement magnesium just in pill form. It wasn't trying to get it from the diet. And I actually felt euphoria for a couple of weeks. And I think that that indicates to me that I had a deficiency that had developed because I felt so good. But after a month or 6 weeks or something, I stopped feeling that. And eventually I stopped taking it. And then a couple years later, I thought, oh, I wonder if maybe now I have that deficiency again because I haven't been taking it. And a couple of times in the course of the last decade, I've tried taking magnesium again, and I never again got any sensation that I could feel that felt differently. So it's possible that I just had this long-term deficiency that needed to be corrected, and now it's fine. But I don't know how you would tell other than assessing how you feel, maybe performance in the gym or mental performance or anything that's important to you, because it's so individual. Even if you do believe the RDAs as given, those are it's not only averages, they're like the 90-something percentile. Like, how much does some of the worst people, the people who have the highest needs, how much do they need? So you can't even go by that, even if you strictly believe that they would apply.
Right. Let me see if there are. Okay. So I had this question. I'm not sure, whether you would even want to respond to it, which is, given the situation that we've been since February and March this year, what are the things that you would recommend watching out for, from the frameworks that you presented about the body?
I think that the best thing that we can do for ourselves is stay as healthy as possible. So it's a really good time to focus on health, I think, as opposed to other things that we value in life. I've always wanted to convey that I don't, even though I have ideas about what might be healthiest for someone, I don't necessarily think that health is the only value in the world. So if someone wants to have a night out or a month out where they're just having food that they enjoy, or even if they never want to prioritize their health, that's their choice. But of course, now is a time where those priorities might shift a little toward health. And I don't know that I have any specifics. I know a lot of people will talk about specific nutrients that they think are really important for immune function, but I don't think that we necessarily have the knowledge to say that kind of thing with any definitive. I think it's an unknown.
Right. One of the other questions that I had in context to what you brought up is let me see how I can frame it. I think on the one hand, there is you and people out there who are kind of, doing this assessment and experimentation and not necessarily accepting things either at face value or, trying to understand how energy, nutrition, etc. works. And of course, then there is the big industry out there, or other the big paradigms out there which are supported by different camps within the industry. How do you? I don't know how to ask this question, or rather, like, what is the question really over here? But how do we think about it in the context of the masses? And I think I ask this question particularly from the point of view of the fact of really being tired of living here in Bangalore and having to constantly put up an argument with my child's school, saying that she should be allowed to eat anything she wants to eat. There is no question about just saying that, it has to be vegetarian only. Yeah, what has been your experience, and, where do you think this sort of mindset would percolate down to a far larger population than just a few of us who kind of understand experimentation and geekery?
It's very difficult. I mean, I've long been frustrated with the education system and how, for example, here where I live in Colorado, in school they get, it may not be direct instruction, although I think there's a little bit about that, but just even in the hallways, posters that are they're not just explaining one point of view, but they're explaining that they're representing it as if it is a known. And I think that's a problem I have with education in a much broader way too, not just about food. But I would really love to see more questioning and more understanding what the scientific basis is. So yeah, I mean, when I meet a new person who's from a different area of my life and doesn't know anything about nutrition necessarily, except what they've heard through ad campaigns and other things, and I tell them about the way I eat, I don't even really know where to start with that, because it's been such a long educational journey for me, just questioning one thing and then looking into it in a way that is deep, like reading the primary literature, which not everyone has the background to do or might feel very intimidated by. So it can be a huge problem, and I don't even necessarily like talking about it, because I don't want to say, oh, you're so stupid, how could you believe that, or everything you've been taught is wrong, or I don't want to be so adversarial about it. So I really would love it if there were more of a, if somebody would make some materials that would start more gently and ask people just to question what's being taught, where that evidence is coming from, and just to nourish or encourage an environment of it being safe to ask, and not of having this authority based culture where things are passed down as that you can't question. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe you want to
No,
elaborate.
No, I think in a sense, I mean, there is some merit to what you're saying. To my mind, I think it comes down to, at one point, the entire battle was about cholesterol is bad or fat is bad. And of course, I know that that's not what you're saying over here, but I think, we kind of went through this. I mean, and we're still going through this argument. And I think particularly here in India, where the notion of tradition that's attached to food is actually very political, and to the extent of dogma, and the fact that if you eat non-vegetarian, there's an aspect of you that's unclean, or else that you yourself are unclean. I think there's a lot of there's a lot to kind of go through. But yeah, at some level, it needs to start with the basic questioning of the authority. There is a question actually for you here by Nadika, and her question is that for some people, a high protein keto diet could be quite contraindicative. She's referring to gout, arthritis, hormonal fluxes. She says, is there any comment on this?
I'm sorry, is the question, is high protein going to make it not ketogenic? Is that?
No, okay, so let's see if I can, or maybe if Nadika is watching, you can comment on it. But I suppose this also comes in from the point of view, at least in India, where the primary cause for gout or arthritis is generally attributed to meat eating, including beef for that matter. So I'm sort of wondering if a question comes in from that angle, which is that do you think that a high protein keto diet could actually be contrary to these health conditions?
Contrary to?
Gout, arthritis, hormonal fluxes, etc.
Oh, no. Well, the thing is, when you're eating a high protein, high fat diet, even if you're eating very high protein, it's still very high fat. And I don't think that eating higher fat than protein is actually sustainable from an energy and hunger level. So anyone that I've interacted with that's been on a carnivore diet for a very long time eventually settles down into somewhere, I would say, between about 20 and 35% protein by calorie. And so I don't actually think that that's high protein. I think that that's a good level of protein. So those diseases like gout, I have a whole presentation about gout in particular, and the fact that many people who have gone on a carnivore diet have actually gotten relief from arthritis would suggest that those diseases aren't coming from protein per se, but from either from a metabolic sort of disability that is being solved by going ketogenic, even with high protein or higher protein, or has to do with eliminating factors that were actually causing damage and resultant inflammation. So yeah, I would just have to say that I don't put much stock in theories about modern disease that would blame protein or fat or animal products for that matter. But of course, I'm happy to look at some research if someone wants to send it to me and tell you what I think is the flaw in the reasoning there.
No, I think, I mean, for a long time, at least in India, this is attributable that, if you have gout, you just have to stop eating meat. I think Logical Links has a comment about whether we're talking about high protein or are we talking about fat over here. I don't know if you want to nuance that.
Um, I'm not sure I understand the question. So yeah, I have a talk about uric acid and gout. It's actually not about gout, it's more about uric acid, but of course, because they're related, I have to talk about that a little bit. And I think that the main culprit there actually is glucose and fructose that are there are different ways and reasons that uric acid can go up. And yes, the breakdown of animal foods can cause uric acid to go up, but uric acid being high doesn't necessarily cause gout. And actually, you can have gout with lower uric acid. And so I think the association has been sullied because most people, there are two ways you can have high uric acid, and one of them involves having metabolic syndrome. And so that's a big conflation. If you take out all the cases of metabolic syndrome, and then just look at high uric acid without metabolic syndrome, I don't think the association with gout's going to be there. And in fact, I think that's where you're going to see the association with high cognitive function, for example, and there's some evidence to support that.
I don't know if you want to sort of make any comments on inflation. Sorry, inflammation. Sorry, such a whatever on inflammation and I mean the bodily condition of inflammation, and therefore how do you have to kind of think about nutrients, nutrition, etc.
Yes, sure. Inflammation gets a bad rap. Inflammation is basically it's your body's response to damage, illness. Um, it's the healing process. And so if you ever have inflammation, that means there's something that needs to be addressed. So you can't necessarily do something that will take down inflammation and have it be a beneficial thing. It depends on how it's reducing the inflammation. If it's reducing the damage that's causing the need for inflammation, then that could be good. But if it's just suppressing inflammation when you need it, for example, that can be bad. There's a lot of modern research that wants to blame inflammation for all of our diseases, but I think it's almost, in certain places where it's written, it's actually meaningless, because what they're saying is disease is caused by damage. The most charitable explanation of what they're saying is that disease is caused by damage, and yes, disease and damage go hand in hand, and therefore inflammation and disease go hand in hand. And you can't say that the inflammation is causing the disease, because in almost all cases, the inflammation is actually a response to the disease. So yes, it can be the case that there is sort of knock-on damage. If the inflammation gets really high, then maybe other things are getting affected by that. So for example, if you have extreme swelling in your brain, that can cause damage to the brain. And so yes, you could say the inflammation caused that, but on the other hand, that wasn't the cause of the swelling in the first place, and that's what we really need to be looking at.
Right. Let me just see if there's. All right. I think Nadika acknowledges that her question has largely been answered, and she mentions that she's just heard so many times right from her childhood that an iron, red meat rich food could cause arthritis to flare up, and that is associated with gout. So I think that's really where it all comes from. I had a concluding question since there are no more questions, which is you did mention willpower, and I don't know if you have any willpower hacks, and also whether you buy into the theory, which I actually read about willpower. I've forgotten the name of the book, which talks about how I think there is a correlation between willpower and diet, including how a high carb diet actually brings down your willpower.
Well, there is a theory, a psychological theory with some evidence to back it, that willpower is kind of a limited resource. So for example, if you have many things going on in your life that require willpower, you're not as likely to succeed. at one of them because there's an overall drain on that willpower, and that may be correct. I know that for me, I do have good willpower for a certain amount of time, but if what I have done hasn't sort of bootstrapped its own momentum, there's only so long that I can carry that on. And for example, there's this idea in dieting for weight loss that you have to do calorie restriction. And calorie restriction means, and I don't mean lowering calories naturally, but actually restricting calories to less than what you're hungry for, means that you're constantly not only applying willpower, but you're fighting against the needs of your body. So in that sense, the low carb diet has a huge advantage that is still not really being acknowledged in a lot of the nutrition world, that it doesn't require willpower for calories to be reduced because you're actually getting satiety at a lower level if you're overweight. And what that means is after the first initial period of maybe less than a week, which does require willpower, after your metabolism changes and you suddenly no longer require willpower. And I think that's why it's so successful. You may have temptations from the social world, but it's not your body's hunger actually driving you to think about eating all the time the way it would be in a caloric restriction kind of situation. So I think willpower is important for making changes, for initiating changes. But if you find yourself doing something, and I think in any area of your life where you're constantly having to apply willpower, you might step back and think, what can I do to make this situation one that carries its own momentum forward? So instead of fighting against some urge that you're always having, make it so that your desires are aligning, so that there's no actual fight. I don't think there's any virtue in applying more willpower. In fact, I think it's a mark that you're doing something wrong if you have to do that for too long.
Right. Well, actually, my question was not really the last question, but Travis Statman actually asked this question saying, should the general public trust engineers or dietitians? And
No. No, you shouldn't trust anyone. You should look at the logic.
I guess that's it from our side. It's past 10 p.m. India time, and I think it's probably just about morning for you. But thank you so much for doing this, for going through all the hoops that we made you go through, and for this really interesting paradigm. I think I'm left with a lot of food for thought. I shouldn't think about food right now, though. But yes, we hope to see more of you, and I'm sure that the Kilter community would really appreciate having more conversations with you. That's all I would say. Thank you so much. For those of you who are watching us, do stay tuned in to hazki.com/Kilter, where these conversations are happening on food science, and food hacks. And we have an interesting community that's gathered around here. A few sessions that are coming up in October are on measurement and temperature and cooking, and how you can adopt simple tools for it. There's one on the basic science of bread, which Krish Ashok will be taking up. So for those of you who are interested, you could stay in touch with keep in touch with that. And we'll have a bunch of sessions coming up on sleep, mental health, and physical health. So do stay tuned. And that's it from our side. Once again, Amber, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for the opportunity.